Critical theory is a school of thought that stresses the reflective assessment and critique of society and culture by applying knowledge from the social sciences and the humanities. As a term, critical theory has two meanings, with different origins and histories. The first originated in sociology, and the second originated in literary criticism, whereby it is used and applied as an umbrella term that can describe a theory founded upon critique. Thus, the theorist Max Horkheimer described a theory as critical insofar as it seeks to liberate human beings from the circumstances that enslave them. In philosophy, the term critical theory describes the neo-Marxist philosophy of the Frankfurt School, which was developed in Germany. In the 1930s, Frankfurt theorists drew on the critical methods of Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud. Critical theory maintains that ideology is the principal obstacle to human liberation. Critical theory was established as a school of thought primarily by 5 Frankfurt School theoreticians: Herbert Marcuse, Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Walter Benjamin, and Erich Fromm. Modern critical theory has been influenced by Georgy Lukács and Antonio Gramsci, as well as the second-generation Frankfurt School scholars, including Jürgen Habermas. In Habermas's work, critical theory transcended its theoretic roots in German idealism and progressed closer to American pragmatism. Concern for social base and superstructure is one of the remaining Marxist philosophic concepts in much of the contemporary critical theory. While critical theorists have been frequently defined as Marxist intellectuals, their tendency to denounce some Marxist concepts and to combine Marxian analysis with other sociologic and philosophic traditions has been labeled as revisionism by classical, orthodox, and analytical Marxists, and by Marxist-Leninist philosophers. Martin J. has stated that the first generation of critical theory is best understood as not promoting a specific philosophical agenda or a specific ideology, but as a gadfly of other systems. Definitions. The two meanings of critical theory from different intellectual traditions associated with the meaning of criticism and critique derive ultimately from the Greek word kritikos, meaning judgment or discernment, and in their present forms go back to the 18th century. While they can be considered completely independent intellectual pursuits, increasingly scholars who are interested in the areas of critique where the two overlap. To use an epistemological distinction introduced by Jürgen Habermas in Erkenntnis und Interesse 1968, knowledge and human interests, critical theory in literary studies is ultimately a form of hermeneutics, i.e. knowledge via interpretation to understand the meaning of human texts and symbolic expressions, including the interpretation of texts which are themselves implicitly or explicitly the interpretation of other texts. Critical social theories, in contrast, a form of self-reflective knowledge involving both understanding and theoretical explanation, to reduce entrapment in systems of domination or dependence, obeying the emancipatory interest in expanding the scope of autonomy and reducing the scope of domination. From this perspective, much literary critical theory, since it is focused on interpretation and explanation rather than on social transformation, would be regarded as positivistic or traditional rather than critical theory, in the Kantian or Marxian sense. Critical theory in literature and the humanities in general does not necessarily involve a normative dimension, whereas critical social theory does, either through criticizing society from some general theory of values, norms, or oughts, or through criticizing it in terms of its own espoused values. Critical theory was first defined by Max Horkheimer, of the Frankfurt School of Sociology, in his 1937 essay Traditional and Critical Theory. Critical theory is a social theory oriented toward critiquing and changing society as a whole, in contrast to traditional theory oriented only to understanding or explaining it. Horkheimer wanted to distinguish critical theory as a radical, emancipatory form of Marxian theory, critiquing both the model of science put forward by logical positivism, and what he and his colleagues saw as the covert positivism and authoritarianism of orthodox Marxism and communism. Core concepts are 1. That critical social theory should be directed at the totality of society and its historical specificity, i.e., how it came to be configured at a specific point in time, and 2. That critical theory should improve understanding of society by integrating all the major social sciences, including geography, economics, sociology, history, political science, anthropology, and psychology. This version of critical theory derives from Kant's 18th century and Marx's 19th century use of the term critique, as in Kant's critique of pure reason and Marx's concept that his work Das Kapital forms a critique of political economy. For Kant's transcendental idealism, critique means examining and establishing the limits of the validity of a faculty, type, or body of knowledge, especially through accounting for the limitations imposed by the fundamental, irreducible concepts in use in that knowledge system. Kant's notion of critique has been associated with the disestablishment of false, unprovable, or dogmatic philosophical, social, and political beliefs, because Kant's critique of reason involved the critique of dogmatic theological and metaphysical ideas, and was intertwined with the enhancement of ethical autonomy, and the Enlightenment critique of superstition and irrational authority. Ignored by many in critical realist circles, however, is that Kant's immediate impetus for writing his critique of pure reason was to address problems raised by David Hume's skeptical empiricism which, in attacking metaphysics, employed reason and logic to argue against the knowability of the world and common notions of causation. Kant, by contrast, pushed the employment of a priori metaphysical claims as requisite, for if anything is to be said to be knowable, it would have to be established upon abstractions distinct from perceivable phenomena. Marx explicitly developed the notion of critique into the critique of ideology, and linked it with the practice of social revolution, as in the famous 11th of his Theses on Feuerbach, philosophers have only interpreted the world in certain ways, the point is to change it. One of the distinguishing characteristics of critical theory, as Adorno and Horkheimer elaborated in their Dialectic of Enlightenment, 1947, is a certain ambivalence concerning the ultimate source or foundation of social domination, an ambivalence which gave rise to the pessimism of the new critical theory over the possibility of human emancipation and freedom. This ambivalence was rooted, of course, in the historical circumstances in which the work was originally produced, in particular, the rise of National Socialism, state capitalism, and mass culture as entirely new forms of social domination that could not be adequately explained within the terms of traditional Marxist sociology. For Adorno and Horkheimer, state intervention in economy had effectively abolished the tension between the relations of production and material productive forces of society, a tension which, according to traditional critical theory, constituted the primary contradiction within capitalism. The market, as an unconscious mechanism for the distribution of goods and private property, had been replaced by centralized planning and socialized ownership of the means of production. Yet, contrary to Marx's famous prediction in the preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy, this shift did not lead to an era of social revolution, but rather to fascism and totalitarianism. As such, critical theory was left, in Jürgen Habermas' words, without anything in reserve to which it might appeal. And when the forces of production enter into a baneful symbiosis with the relations of production that they were supposed to blow wide open, there is no longer any dynamism upon which critique could base its hope. For Adorno and Horkheimer, this posed the problem of how to account for the apparent persistence of domination in the absence of the very contradiction that, according to traditional critical theory, was the source of domination itself. In the 1960s, Jürgen Habermas raised the epistemological discussion to a new level in his knowledge and human interests by identifying critical knowledge as based on principles that differentiated it either from the natural sciences or the humanities through its orientation to self-reflection and emancipation. Though unsatisfied with Adorno and Horkheimer's thought presented in Dialectic of Enlightenment, Habermas shares the view that, in the form of instrumental rationality, the era of modernity marks a move away from the liberation of enlightenment and toward a new form of enslavement. His ideas regarding the relationship between modernity and rationalization are in this sense strongly influenced by Max Weber. Habermas dissolved further the elements of critical theory derived from Hegelian German idealism, though his thought remains broadly Marxist in its epistemological approach. Perhaps his two most influential ideas are the concepts of the public sphere and communicative action, the latter arriving partly as a reaction to new post-structural or so-called postmodern challenges to the discourse of modernity. Habermas engaged in regular correspondence with Richard Rorty, and a strong sense of philosophical pragmatism may be felt in his theory, thought which frequently traverses the boundaries between sociology and philosophy. Postmodern critical theory. While modernist critical theory, as described above, concerns itself with forms of authority and injustice that accompanied the evolution of industrial and corporate capitalism as a political economic system, postmodern critical theory politicizes social problems by situating them in historical and cultural contexts, to implicate themselves in the process of collecting and analyzing data, and to relativize their findings. Meaning itself is seen as unstable due to the rapid transformation in social structures. As a result, the focus of research is centered on local manifestations rather than broad generalizations. Postmodern critical research is also characterized by the crisis of representation, which rejects the idea that a researcher's work is an objective depiction of a stable other. Instead, many postmodern scholars have adopted alternatives that encourage reflection about the politics and poetics of their work. In these accounts, the embodied, collaborative, dialogic, and improvisational aspects of qualitative research are clarified. The term critical theory is often appropriated when an author, perhaps most notably Michel Foucault, works within sociological terms, yet attacks the social or human sciences, thus attempting to remain outside those frames of inquiry. Jean Baudrillard has also been described as a critical theorist to the extent that he was an unconventional and critical sociologist. This appropriation is similarly casual, holding little or no relation to the Frankfurt School. Language and construction. The 2 points at which there is the greatest overlap, or mutual impingement of the two versions of critical theory are in their interrelated foci on language, symbolism, and communication, and in their focus on social construction. Language and communication. From the 1960s and 1970s onward, language, symbolism, text, and meaning came to be seen as the theoretical foundation for the humanities, through the influence of Ludwig Wittgenstein, Ferdinand de Saussure, George Herbert Mead, Noam Chomsky, Hans-Georg Gadamer, Roland Barthes, Jacques Derrida, and other thinkers in linguistic and analytic philosophy, structural linguistics, symbolic interactionism, hermeneutics, semiology, linguistically oriented psychoanalysis, Jacques Lacan, Alfred Lorenzer, and deconstruction. When, in the 1970s and 1980s, Jürgen Habermas redefined critical social theory as a theory of communication, i.e. communicative competence, and communicative rationality on the one hand, distorted communication on the other, the two versions of critical theory began to overlap to a much greater degree than before. Construction. Both versions of critical theory have focused on the processes by which human communication, culture, and political consciousness are created. This includes whether it is through universal pragmatic principles through which mutual understanding is achieved, Habermas. The semiotic rules by which objects obtain symbolic meanings, Barthes. The psychological processes by which the phenomena of everyday consciousness are generated, psychoanalytic thinkers. The episteme that underlies our cognitive formations, Foucault. There is a common interest in the processes, often of a linguistic or symbolic kind, that gave rise to observable phenomena, and here there is some mutual influence among the different versions of critical theory. Ultimately, this emphasis on production and construction goes back to the revolution in philosophy wrought by Kant, namely his focus in the critique of pure reason on synthesis according to rules as the fundamental activity of the mind that creates the order of our experience.